Hello and welcome to Chapter 7, all about designing a research study. So this is looking at the components of the study and how you decided to set it up the way you set it up. And this is something that many of you are working on this week as you map out your research project for this class. So really the second step after deciding what your research question is, after you do that, you have to decide about your design. And most of you at least have some thoughts about your research design. And your design will impact who you're going to study. For example, some of you are looking at cyberbullying as a topic. And so are you, who is going to be studied? Are you interested in parents' perspectives on cyberbullying? Are you interested in adolescents' perspective on cyberbullying? Or are you interested in teachers' perspectives? Or are you interested in all three? So how you frame your research question will be linked to the population that you actually wind up studying. Then you decide how your data is going to be collected. And again, this gets back to your methodology. Is it through interviews because you're going to do inductive style questions? Is it through a survey because you're collecting either descriptive data or more numerical data? And then you're going to decide how the concepts and variables will be measured and analyzed. So if your question was on cyberbullying, one of the first things you'd have to do is define what that meant. What does it mean to be cyberbullied? What is the definition that you're going to work from? And then, variables that are associated with that. So you begin to think about independent and dependent variables that we covered in our Chapter 6. And then also, how will you measure these? Will you measure them by frequency, by exposure, by intensity? All of those things become important. And this is the part where you develop the tool as you are doing this week in class. So there are lots of different ways to go about obtaining data and getting your sample population together. And I've talked with most of you because of the nature of this class and the framework of what we're doing. Most of you are doing a convenient sample, meaning you're identifying a group of people who you have some access to so that you're able to get information from them. Another method of accessing data is something that's called secondary research and data. And this is an interesting model. Sometimes you may have noticed some of you picked secondary data analysis articles for your literature critique. And secondary data is different than a literature review. Secondary data actually takes the original numbers that somebody else collected and then reanalyzes those numbers to ask a question. So in effect, secondary data would be if you gave a survey to the entire class for the purposes of your study, and then I said to you, hey, could I take a look at that survey? I've got another question. Could I take a look at that survey data? I'd like to see if that will answer my question. And you turned your data over to me, and I analyzed it from that. Then I haven't had any individual contact with you all as a student. I'm simply using the secondary data that someone else collected. And the really common example of secondary research data is the census data. So every 10 years, and then some smaller parts of the census happen in between that, but the government goes out and collects data. And then analysts, researchers all over the country and all over the world use the data, the original data points collected by the census, to develop analyses and to draw conclusions and to describe populations and communities and look at problems. So you recall in last chapter that we talked about several different types of studies, and the first study we talked about was the descriptive study. And this is where you're just really taking a snapshot of an issue. You're trying to describe a particular phenomena. And so descriptive studies very often come from, they can come from survey data, from structured or unstructured interviews, from observation, or from existing documents. This is true about any one of the study, but what you're really looking for in data collection for descriptive studies is targeting as many people as possible, or having a random sampling of the population that you're trying to describe, and collecting frequencies, numbers, data about that population so that you can describe the experiences. Sometimes you can use existing documents. This is a common phenomena. For example, data collection happens in Alaska around the birth defects registry. So for example, if you're interested in fetal alcohol syndrome in Alaska, you may read that we have a high rate of fetal alcohol syndrome. And the reason that we know we have a high rate of fetal alcohol syndrome in Alaska is because we have something called the birth defects registry. And anytime a medical provider suspects that an Alaskan baby is born prenatally exposed to alcohol, that file is flagged and notified the Department of Health and Social Services, and then those medical charts of that child are at some point reviewed by staff at the Department of Health and Social Services, and then it's determined whether or not they're included or excluded in the count for prenatal alcohol exposure if they meet the diagnosis. The Health and Social Services staff will never meet that child. They will only use the data, the records that are available through the child's medical chart, and they have access to that data through a state law that allows them access for certain birth defects that are specified. So the second type of study that we discussed in last chapter is the exploratory study, and many of you are doing exploratory studies for your proposed research projects for this class. And frequently exploratory studies involve unstructured interviews. Rarely do they involve scales. Rarely do they involve very structured interviews or questionnaires or surveys. Very often they may involve observation, particularly observation in a natural setting, and then also use of existing documents like we talked about. So you all who are doing exploratory studies are developing, most of you are developing unstructured interview questions or an interview schedule. And then explanatory studies, they tend to be more quantitative in nature. They tend to be more structured. So you see more structured interviews, questionnaires, observations, and use of existing documents or data to explain, and this is the causal study that we talked about and why causal studies are so difficult to create because of the need to sample a large portion of your population, a random portion of your population, and if possible to have control groups. So as you all are working through your projects this week, some of the key questions that you may be asking about your research design is, who will be the source of the data? Who am I going to ask? And in fact, I talked with a number of you about that. Who is this question directed to? Which group of people is the right source for this information? How will you collect the data? Will you sit down and interview them? Will you send out an online survey? Will you do a combination of those things? And then again, getting back to this idea of measuring concepts. How are we defining aspects of our study? What are your definitions for your major terms? What are your definitions for your independent and dependent variables? How are we going to measure them? And then how are we going to analyze them? And the way that we do that will be, of course, linked to the methods that we select in the first place. So as a consumer of research, one of the first things you want to look at in any given research paper is you want to take a look at their sampling method. That tells you a lot about how generalizable the study is, meaning how whether or not you're able to take that study and apply it to a different group of people and have the findings of that study fit. So when you have a randomized controlled trial, a randomized sample, and a control group, and that sample is drawn from a particular population, you are able to generalize the findings and say what happened with this group of people will probably be what happens with most people. You'll see this a lot in polling data. So they very carefully select their sample, randomly controlled sample of the population when they take poll data for the elections. And that's the way that they're able to predict prior to the elections within a certain margin of error who people are planning on voting for. They don't obviously talk to everybody, but the way that they sample becomes reflective of the larger population as a whole, and they're able to generalize. The sampling method that a number of you are looking at, as we talked about, is a convenient sample. And convenient samples are used often because they're convenient, because it's difficult to get people to participate in studies. And so a convenient sample is talking with people that you are able to get to communicate with you about your study. It's not random, and therefore the findings from a sample of convenience are not necessarily generalizable, and we have to be careful about our conclusions when we use a non-randomized sample. Other questions that you want to look at when you look at research is who is the population, right? So if we are talking about a certain group of people or a randomized sample from a certain group of people, Who are those people? Where were the participants pulled from? To whom does this research sample apply to? So are we talking about indigenous youth? Are we talking about all youth? Are we talking about Alaska youth? Are we talking about American youth? Are we talking about girls? Are we talking about boys? Are we talking about youth under the age of 12? Are we talking about youth between 12 and 18? So clearly identifying your population is a really important part in understanding a study when you look at it or when you write it yourself. And then looking at the diversity within that study. And lots of sampling methods have issues with diversity. There may be lots of reasons why we struggle to obtain diversity in our study sample, but you strive for diversity within the parameters of the population, right? So if the parameter of your study is teens, you're not looking for people outside of that parameter, but you do want to get diverse groups of teens. So you may want to get teens from different socioeconomic groups, teens from different life experiences, teens from potentially different cultures if you're looking non-culture specific in your research question. You're also going to want to ask about data collection. How was the data collected? Through interviews, through surveys, and how were those surveys administered and collected back? Does it seem like a fit between the question and the method? And then are the variables appropriately defined? So are they defined and measured in a way that makes sense, logical sense, to what you know and understand about the issue?